Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we are breaking down a new mechanic that has been introduced. But first I have a couple of cards left from the set of 15 that we didn't quite cover, so we're going to cover those first. Go through them real quick. The first one is Isolate, kill an enemy unit that is attacking alone, which as far as things go just looks like a pretty solid, interesting draft fast spell. So it's just a neat little trick that defines the meta in the same way that Entrapment would define the meta. This is something where you actually have to keep an eye out for this card when it's open. You have to play around it. It's something that adds a level of skill to draft and a level of consideration of what your opponent actually has to have. This is a trick to watch out for, and I would say it's kind of viable in ranked, although killing an enemy unit that is attacking alone, while it does occur pretty frequently, is not necessarily something that you're going to have a lot of want for. This is fine. It does some of the same job as Defiance in countering aggro, so if you want to get really, really aggressive, there's some potential that it helps out a little bit in addition to Defiance, and you can Defiance something and then Isolate and addition, but I think it's not likely to make any lists as other than a draft removal card. Still, it's a decently strong draft removal card, and it's a good popper removal card if you need some good interaction to play your control decks and you don't have a lot of the nastier stuff, which, yeah, overall, I think that this is a decent card, should help the meta quite a bit, and should make the draft environment a lot more interesting, so I'm pretty down with that. I think the other card that we missed was Gust Rider. This is a 1/1 flyer with Onslaught, Draw 2, Discard 2. That's a very strong Onslaught in general, and Gust Rider as a 1/1 flyer for 1 is not that bad a card. 1/1 flyer for 1 is pretty bare minimal as to what it is that you can play, but the Onslaught ability is very, very strong, so if you're playing a decently aggressive deck with sort of a mix of a desire to do a lot of looting and a desire to do a lot of damage, then you can potentially get some pretty good value out of this. Also, this card enables some pretty strong resurrection-based strategies, any sort of void-based stuff. You can do some really interesting things with it. The main part, it's one in that kind of interesting eternal design space where some of the things that are interesting about the card, the fact that it is a tiny, tiny flyer, are at odds with other things about the card, like the fact that it is a very, very good mill card. It's designed that's specifically limiting your ability to do the thing that you most want to do, which is trigger that onslaught, by the thing that you have to do, which is attack with a unit on turn 1 or turn 2 to actually get the onslaught for cheap. Nonetheless, this card seems like it's got some pretty good control potential. If you're playing creature-based control with a decent amount of aggression in it, I think you can actually get some really good results out of this. This card pairs well with Yeti Spy. If you're just playing a simple 1-drop unit and swinging in and then using this to draw and discard cards, you can get a very well-shaped hand for whatever control setup that you're looking to do, and that's potentially got some strength to it. The main problem is that you do have to expend a card on it, and that means that you're maybe not going to get as much value as you normally would want to. Still, it's a solid combo enabler. The combos, if they involve the Void, are going to be particularly strong. If you have cards like Privilege of Rank that you always want to toss away, this is a card that really does that, and it does it in a lot more strength than you would generally see. So this is a really deceptive card, not terribly stat efficient, probably not an aggro card, but potentially in some sort of tempo combo deck. It's got some interesting potential. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely a lot of difficulty to play, but overall should be well worth it for the payoff. And this is a card that you would actually play in draft, just because both the Onslaught and the Tiny Flyer are good bodies for you, and that's things that you need, or things that you want. So seems pretty solid. With that, and without further ado, let's get into our new mechanic, which is Twist. So Twist is a mechanic that specifically reads, give a unit +1 strength and -1 health to do something. So when you twist a Razor Quill, for example, you pay 1, Razor Quill becomes a 3/3 permanently, and then you deal 1 damage to the enemy player and gain 1 health. Any unit that has Twist basically has an activatable ability that can, based off of some particular cost, change the overall shape of the unit into a more aggressive unit while giving you some other mild benefit. This is a really interesting mechanic. It is, I would say, a very strong limited mechanic because it turns most units that are very, very good defenders into better attackers later on, and that's something that really is quite helpful if you're playing the tempo game. You want to play a 4-drop into your opponent's attacking stuff and then turn your 4-drop into an attacker on the next turn while also gaining a bunch of life. This is a good way to stabilize a little bit and sort of get some interesting value out of your overall setup. Razor Quill is not the strongest Twist card by any means. There are much stronger ones that we're going to be going into, but as far as that goes, this is the kind of limited mechanic that like really gives you a useful power sink that you can do some pretty cool things with. It's not currently limited by turn. Sometimes it's going to be a once per turn, but well, I'm not sure if we saw any once per turns in the current setup. No, we didn't. So like this is something that is basically limited by the health of the unit. Some interesting things about this. Since the negative health damage is permanent, Twist does not work terribly well with most Graveyard Recursion. You get at most 1 extra Twist off of Dark Return, because Dark Return gives you an additional +1/+1. What Twist does behave very well with is anything that raises the health of the unit. So for example, cards like Razor Quill and another card that we're going to be going into, Bulbous Humbug, play really well with cards like Crystalline Chalice, because you can use Crystalline Chalice to give yourself an extra +2/+2, and then you can use Twist to start bringing the health down and bringing the attack up, while also getting a bunch of like beneficial things that you can use over and over and over again. Basically, Twist provides a simple countdown mechanic on the unit that you can then use to effectively sort of measure how much you can get out of the card. Obviously, since it also lowers the health of the unit, it makes the unit more vulnerable as it goes along. Razor Quill starts out as a unit that can't be killed by Torch or Vanquish, and gradually turns into a card that can be killed by both. So the more that you twist, the more fragile the unit is, the more offensive the unit is, and generally the less valuable the unit is. But the stat lines are typically not based around that idea, and oftentimes you're going to be twisting the unit for the twist ability specifically, and not so much for the body that the unit is attached to. Nonetheless, this is a really interesting way to design engine cards. I think it's pretty cool as far as mechanics go. It's going to make a really fun limited environment, just because like there's a lot of interesting stuff that can happen with it, and like the way that it sort of allows you to change around your unit's power while also doing particular things is pretty good. I would say it's not terribly complicated to figure out. If there are an awful lot of twist cards, that could increase board complexity to the point where it might be difficult, but I think that like overall most of the designs have seemed pretty simple, and they're things that we shouldn't have too much of a problem grokking. Razor Quill, of course, yep, definitely does trigger a lot of life force options. This card is a good way to steal life from people. The card's unit ability is not that useful, but it's a super cheap way to trigger life force. It's basically an amethyst ring that you can trigger 4 times for 1, which is pretty decent. Like overall, that's not a bad thing to have, and yeah, there's some serious potential for that in like a Mask or other life force enabled deck. I would say overall this card in particular does not have the stats to succeed in a tier 1 environment, even if the pay 1 ability is useful, because 4 cost for a 2/4 is just a lot, and this ability is not that useful overall. It's decent, but it's probably a little bit too slow. It's definitely a little bit too vulnerable, and like, oh, it's awfully expensive for what you're doing. Another card that we will be looking at that might be a little bit more playable is Bulbous Humbug, and this is a card that I specifically like for Chalice-based decks. Bulbous Humbug is a 1/2 flyer with pay 2 and twist Bulbous Humbug to draw a sigil of your choice from your deck. So a much more powerful twist ability for a slightly higher cost, effectively allows you to grab extra power from your deck while also turning your Humbug into a more aggressive flyer. So this is a 3-cost 1/2 that you turn into a 2/1, while also drawing an extra card and replacing the card. In draft, that's actually a really, really powerful effect. Basically, like you're going to be super happy to turn a 3-cost into a 2/1 while also replacing the 3-cost card. Like that's not at all bad for you. And then in addition, if the flyer somehow becomes useless over the course of the game, it gets permafrosted, somebody has a bigger flyer, you can't really deal with that kind of thing, then this is the type of card that you can definitely just continue to twist to kill it, and then get yourself extra cards and effectively draw 2 cards over the course of the game. So net card advantage, very, very slow, but potentially effective in that kind of strategy. And since it also has some value as a unit, and a unit that changes in complexity over time, this is something where you're actually going to get a lot more value out of having the unit be bigger based off of other effects. If you're using War Cries or any sort of ability to actually buff twist units, then this card turns from just a small amount of card advantage to an extreme amount of card advantage. And in decks like Chalice, you can potentially play a Bulbous Humbug, immediately you pay 2 to like beef it up, and then if you have a bunch of power, just draw sigil after sigil after sigil and pull it all out of your deck, New Tomorrow style, for as long as you want. Like basically, as long as you have the ability to give this card health, this card will draw you additional cards, which has some potential strength in a control-based setting. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Again, this card is very slow. It's not amazing in a ranked environment, but I would say that it's got some interesting shenanigans to it, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it in, at the very least, Chalice, and potentially some other interesting control-style decks. So could be very fun. Yeah, so twist cards, like, overall have really interesting mechanics, and the way that you design the card, how much health it has, how much strength it has, really determines how the card is played. For example, while Bulbous Humbug is probably going to belong in more control-based decks, Headhunter is very clearly a really, really aggressive card. This is a 2/1 Gunslinger Minotaur. One-cost gunslingers are important for very obvious reasons. This is actually like a super strong card for specifically that reason, because we've talked a little bit about how the one-cost gunslinger for in red is actually quite powerful just for its ability to have hideout pistol played on it. Headhunter is that, but in Argenport colors, which Argenport gunslingers are completely insane, and like this is a particular setup that actually has, I think, a lot of potential. This is the one card that I think is going to see ranked play, specifically in Argenport gunslingers, and make some interesting aggressive stuff happen. So, one cost 2/1, basically a vanilla unit, but you pay 2 and you twist it, you turn it into a wanted poster, which kills it, but also allows you to get an extra 2 cards off of a torch or a suffocate or any other type of effect that you might want to do, which if you're currently like sitting on a board where you've just played like say a Headhunter into a Ripknife Assassin and your opponent has just played like a 2/3 unit in front of you, then that's a really conceivably good option to just draw a bunch of cards, replace your hand with even more gunslingers, and Headhunter, having outlived its usefulness, can go to the void. But if you're playing gunslingers, you also potentially have a lot of aggressive stuff, you potentially have a lot of Warcry stuff. So feasibly, this card could turn into a lot of card advantage over time, because it is a card that specifically benefits when you are drawing it later in the game with a bunch of Warcries on it. If you have some way to make this card bigger, then yeah, that's pretty wild. Surprise twist, Kalos the Reckoning and all of their raiders are here. Thank you so much for the raid, Kalos. We are doing a YouTube breakdown, so we'll talk about it a little bit more after that. Yeah, so this is wild. Like, we are I'm pretty happy with this design. I think this one is the strongest of the 3 twist cards, possibly the strongest of the 4 twist cards that have been revealed so far. It's really, really aggressive. It actually has some potentially good possibilities in mid-range or control setups, like once you start to actually get into that space. And like overall, it's just another really solid 1-drop that you can play out and do some pretty cool things with. So yeah, Headhunter's wild. I love the little mohawk on the Minotaur. It makes it look very strange. It's like it has a 3rd horn. Inadvisable fashion choices for Minotaurs. But yeah, it's pretty cute. Okay, so the last twist card is the most impactful and also the most greedy. This is Lorai the Appraiser, and this card is obviously pretty strong, but to what extent is gonna be an interesting question. So Lorai the Appraiser is a 0/6, with the enemy player can't attack with relic weapons or activate relics, which, yeah, it's a powerful hate ability. That means that Auric Runehammer is significantly less beneficial, and also that a lot of the activatable relic abilities could be potentially something that you aren't going to have to deal with, which is crazy stuff. Like, there's definitely some decent possibilities with that. So that's just an always-on ability that basically shuts off relics and shuts off relic weapons as long as the unit is alive, which as a 3-cost card could be for a very long time, considering it also has 6 health. 0/6s are surprisingly durable. Cards like Campfire Watchman can actually see play in certain ranked decks if you are really, really, really brave, because while they don't really have any value, they stop most units, including Sandstorm Titan, and they survive 2/2s while still surviving torches on top of 2/2s, as well as Finest Hours, everything along those lines. This card is a sick control card for that particular reason. The pay 3 ability, Twist Lorai to draw a relic from your deck with cost equal to her health, I believe gets you a 5-cost relic at first. Equal to is a really important part of that question, because it means that if you want to run Lorai the Appraiser, you have to run relics of different types in order to gain the most value out of her. If you have just a 5-cost relic that you want to get to, and you're okay with playing Lorai and sacking Lorai's, or basically using Lorai's ability once and that's it, then that's a pretty decent way to build your deck. If you want to build a deck that goes all the way down to 1, that's a much more difficult way to build your deck, but you will get a lot more value out of Lorai the Appraiser that way. I would say it's safe to say that you want at least a 5-cost and a 4-cost relic, something like Xenon Obelisk and something in the 5-cost range. there aren't that many 5-cost relics, so that's going to be exciting. Hopefully we'll see some cool ones here. And like, yeah, overall, that's just going to be like a crazy, crazy pile of stuff. I think that's actually going to be pretty interesting to see overall. So I think that basically with Lorai, you probably build 5-4 and maybe 1-3, but you probably don't go too much deeper than that. If you do want to go all the way, then that's great. But it's also a question of like how much you can do with it and at what times. I think with like a New Tomorrow type setup where you actually just like pull a bunch of power, somehow get a bunch of power, like, or a relatively close to infinite amount of power, you can twist Lorai to draw an effective 6 cards, which is crazy and a lot of fun. I think there's some decent possibilities for that, and it's certainly going to be fun to see if we can actually do something cool with that. I'd love to see cards that actually put in relics of different types into your deck and other ways to use Lorai for that reason. But yeah, this is a card that requires some very, very specific finagling to build a good Lorai deck, and that's going to be dependent on our overall card pool for both this set and for the previous sets in the whole setup. That being said, she looks very strong. I think she's going to be a really decent card in blue just because 6 for a 1/5 and also just pick a relic out of your deck is not that bad an idea. So I think that feasibly that's something that you can actually do some cool things with. And like overall, this card doesn't feel too bad to play on 3, actively blocks Sandstorm Titan and a lot of the more aggressive stuff, allows you to sort of keep yourself alive while you dig for other stuff. I'm pretty interested in this card. I think it's definitely got some cool potential and hopefully can get a really good amount of cards played out and do some crazy, crazy things. But it is a very, very strict build around me card. I forgot one card, so we're going to go into that one next, and it's actually not a bad finisher. That is Zumaken the Surveyor, which was revealed a little bit ago. This is a 6/6 ambush warp with when Zumaken kills a unit, play a 1/1 Explorer. At first glance, this card doesn't seem as powerful as the previous 5-cost in 5 influence that we have seen, and it does appear that this is a cycle, which is also a strong indicator, especially considering all of the other cards that we've seen, that this is not a tricolor set, but is instead going to be focused on color pairings of particular types, or potentially just monocolor factions, and more development of those particular factions. We've seen some monocolored beneficial cards, we've seen a monocolored cycle that is really, really deeply monocolored. Having triple colors at this point seems like it's just not going to happen. That's way too much space for design that just isn't going to happen. Potentially we could see 1 to 2 different factions introduced, tricolors or otherwise, but it looks like this is going to be a more monocolor developed set as a result of cards like Zumaken the Surveyor being in our pool. So yeah, there's some potential there. All right, so Zumaken, 6/6 ambush warp. That means that if you play this card off the top of your deck, you can immediately kill something that your opponent doesn't really necessarily have the ability to deal with. Like, basically, this is a really interesting surprise because you can play it on an empty hand and kill a Sandstorm Titan with it, which is wild, wild times. The kill a unit ability is not that powerful. Playing a 1/1 Explorer is very nice if you're playing, you know, mono time with Xenon Obelisk or mono time with the more obvious Clock of Stolen Hours. Like, there's some cool stuff there, and actually I think I'm gonna look up Clock of Stolen Hours real quick here, but Clock of Stolen Hours is when you start your turn with 12 units, take an additional turn after this one. So Zumaken the Surveyor is a very, very good card to run in a Clock of Stolen Hours deck, since if you ambush this card out, you can potentially go up 2 units as a surprise in a turn where you might have as many as 10 units out. So yeah, there's some cool possibilities with that, especially if you have ways to give Zumaken Killer or do other interesting shenanigans there, like, well, Killer actually doesn't make a difference here, but there are some possibilities. So yeah, this card is very interesting. It's got some similarities to Reinhardt Humpek, as some people are pointing out, but I would say this card is a lot better because it's a lot less expensive. It's actually an effective ambush, and it will very frequently actually get the thing that it wants to kill, as opposed to larger ambush units, which typically have a pretty hard time. I have used Teriax before, Hunting Teriax, the 5/3 ambush for 5, and that card is pretty okay at killing stuff every now and then. It frequently functions as a removal card. A 6/6 is miles better than that. And so Zumakin's immediate impact as an ambush card is where its strength lies, as well as its overall just really nice stat line. A 6/6 for 5 is definitely not that bad, especially not especially in time, but in general. It's just a big unit, it does good things, and you can play it as a surprise in situations where you normally wouldn't be able to. So I think that's got some really, really interesting potential. So that's it. All of our twist cards, I would say, looks like it's going to be a really, really fun mechanic. I'm looking forward to seeing more twist in the future, because we'll have a clearer idea of what's going on when we know what all of the twist cards are. But it looks like there's some powerful, interesting ranked deck enablers. There's some really, really cool limited cards. And like overall, this set is shaping up to be a really interesting format that should simplify and also make the meta a little bit more fun. So I'm pretty down with that, and hopefully we'll see some really, really cool stuff with that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and to the YouTube folks, we're going to head off, but to the Twitch folks, we're headed back to some games. So thank you again, and see you next time. Cheers.